Greetings, fellow adventurers, and welcome to the Couple of Nerds podcast. I'm DnDWife, the creator of DnDWifeStories.com, and your co-host. Joining me is the man behind the screen, my brilliant dungeon master, and also my husband, Eguile. Say hi, Eguile.
Hey everyone, excited to be here sharing our nerdy adventures with all of you.
Absolutely. So what's Couple of Nerds all about? Well, we're diving into the realms of Extrayus, sharing our experiences, playing D&D in our apartment, and exploring the intricate tapestry of relationships both in and out of the game.
And we got some exciting segments for you all, from lore deep dives to crafting tips, artwork showcases, and relationship advice on and off the table. We've got a little bit of everything for every kind of adventurer.
So whether you're a seasoned adventurer or a tabletop newbie, we invite you to join us today. Tune in, relax, and enjoy the magic of Couple of Nerds. May your rolls be natural 20s and your adventures be legendary.
Standing before the esteemed members of the Elven Council, I feel the weight of their gaze upon me, a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and perhaps a hint of disdain. I do not waver, for I know that the truth must be spoken, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. My fellow council members, I begin, my voice steady despite the turmoil raging within me. I stand before you today not as an adversary, but as a voice of reason, a voice calling for change, for enlightenment, for redemption. The council chamber is silent, save for the rustling of robes and the occasional whisper of intrigue. I can feel their eyes upon me, searching for weakness, for vulnerability. I stand tall, my gaze unwavering as I address them with conviction and resolve. For too long, we, the elves, have walked a path of ignorance. I continue, my voice echoing off the marble walls. We have wielded the power of the Fae without understanding its true nature, without realizing the consequences of our actions. And in doing so, we have brought ruin upon ourselves and upon the world we call home. Some among the council nod in agreement, while others scoff at my words, dismissing them as the ramblings of a madwoman. I pay them no heed. I know that the truth cannot be denied, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. The cosmic magics are the root of all creation, I declare, my voice ringing with conviction. They flow through the veins of the world, shaping its destiny and guiding its course. And yet we have turned our backs on these magics, blinded by our own arrogance and ambition. There is murmuring among the council members, a restless energy that fills the chamber with tension. I stand firm, refusing to be swayed by their doubt and skepticism. I know that the fate of our world hangs in the balance, and I will not rest until balance is restored. Change is never easy, I conclude, my voice ringing with determination. But it is necessary if we are to thrive and survive. I implore you, my fellow council members, to open your hearts and minds to the truth that lies beyond our narrow perceptions. Together, we can forge a new future, one built upon understanding, compassion, and unity. With those final words, I stepped back from the podium, my heart pounding with anticipation. The fate of our world hangs in the balance, and only time will tell if my words have fallen upon open ears. But one thing is certain, I will not rest until balance is restored, until the cosmic magics once again flow freely, untainted by the folly of our past. As the echoes of my words fade within the council chamber, a tense silence descends. A silence pregnant with anticipation, with uncertainty, and with the simmering tension of conflict on the horizon. The council members exchange glances, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, anger, and scorn. Some scoff openly, their laughter like daggers aimed at my heart. Others shake their head in disdain, their eyes filled with a coldness that chills me to the bone. "This is madness," one council declares, his voice dripping with contempt. "To suggest that our way of life is flawed, that our magic is tainted, is nothing short of heresy." The murmurs of agreement ripple through the chamber like a gathering storm, each word a dagger aimed at my resolve. I stand alone amidst a sea of opposition, my heart heavy with their weight of their condemnation. Outside the council chamber, the whispers of dissent spread like wildfire through the streets of Elunor. The people recoil in horror at the notion that their cherished beliefs may be nothing more than a facade, a lie perpetuated by generations of ignorance and arrogance. Angry mobs gather in the city squares, their voices raised in protest, their fists clenched in defiance. They demand retribution for my words, for daring to challenge the status quo, for threatening the very foundation of their society. But amidst the chaos and turmoil, my thoughts turn to those who stand by my side, a loyal husband and friend, and my sweet Luna. I refuse to abandon them in their hour of need. Alone, I weather the storm of hatred and condemnation, drawing strength from the thoughts of each of them as I face the onslaught of backlash. The days turn into weeks, and still the animosity towards me shows no signs of abating. The council moves to strip me of my title and position, casting me out into the wilderness to fend for myself. But I do not falter, for I know that my cause is just, that my beliefs are true. Happy, knowing that my family is safe away from their reach. And so, I stand firm in the face of adversity, my resolve unshaken by the storm of hatred and condemnation that surrounds me. For I know that even in the darkest of times, there is always a glimmer of hope, a spark of light that can illuminate the path forward. And no matter what the future may hold, I will continue to fight for the truth, for justice, and for the redemption of our world. Luna, I hope one day you can forgive me. Oh, that was... I want to cry a little.
I know. It's great to see from like someone's perspective what like actually is going down, because, you know, they don't exist anymore.
Yeah. Well, welcome everybody to another episode of Couple of Nerds. I'm your host, DnDWife, and with me is my husband and co-host, Dungeon Master Eguile.
How's it going, everyone?
Welcome. So today we're just going to take a more captivating journey into the depths of our Extrayus lore.
Yeah, today we're going to be doing another set of lore drop, and this is part 2 when looking into the species known as the Elves in Extrayus. And the first episode, if you hadn't caught it, it's online for streaming. We first looked at the genesis of the elves.
Yeah, how they came to be.
These creatures created from the very fabric of magic itself. And through that creation, they had this kind of unnatural connection to magic, and they had this ability to read the magic itself. And essentially what they were reading is this kind of history of every time someone cast a spell. Right. And so we learned how that manipulation allowed them to kind of gain this advantage very quickly in the realm of Extrayus, because they just had this masterful control of magic.
Cool.
And then we talked about how through that magic, they found a connection to a magic they had never heard, seen, or read before. And in doing so, they had gained this ability to grow this giant tree that essentially connected all of the continents of Extrayus and unified all of the races. Now, unbeknownst to the other races upon the planet, they were also using that to gather some of the life energy of the various races to help the tree grow. So once we kind of got into their situation and how they kind of established themselves, we felt there was so much more to look at to the elves. So we really wanted to give a little more of a deep dive into the elves, which is why we're going to look into kind of what caused the chain reaction to their own self-destruction.
As always, if you are part of our table, just make sure that if you don't want to know, don't listen.
Spoiler alert, definitely. So really what really kind of is an interesting perspective is that, you know, as the elves are these kind of very long living species. At this point, none of them have even shown any semblance of old age.
Yeah.
So like no elf has died in the last thousands of years of old age.
They still look the same as when they were
First created.
came into being, essentially.
Right. And so what ends up happening though is they're watching all the other races and they're seeing their populations dwindle and then grow, and they're seeing progeny and descendants,
procreation,
and they're seeing numbers explode due to procreation.
Yeah.
Well, the elves themselves obviously only understanding magic, and magic doesn't really tell you how to do the birds and the bees.
Yeah.
They didn't quite have an understanding as to how it worked. They looked at regular, the old-fashioned way as being too unpredictable. You couldn't control the parameter.
Yeah, you're taking a chance on, the type of child and the characteristics that are going to come with that child when they're born.
Yeah, and so given that the elves had this such intrinsic ability to read magic, they always assumed there's a solution within magic.
Of course.
And after kind of reading the weave for a long enough time, they eventually came up and found what they thought was their perfect solution.
Yeah.
They discovered the ability or this magic spell that would allow them to make nigh perfect copies of themselves.
Yeah, almost perfect.
Right. And so because of that, they thought this is the best way to grow their numbers. They could essentially copy their strongest, their best and brightest. And now they have two of their best and brightest.
Yeah.
And so what this started is this kind of idea of it didn't really matter. Just make multiple copies as much as you could, because they didn't quite understand the spell itself. They knew of its effect, but not necessarily of the consequences to said spell.
It's like when you're a player and you only read the part you like, the first part, but then the fine print you just don't look at.
Right, where you have to look as a DM and you're like, keep reading.
Yeah.
Keep reading. So they didn't quite know and understand that. And what they started to notice as their population boomed, they noticed that a large chunk of the population never really gained any more skills.
Yeah.
They would be obviously paired with their partner, essentially their clone.
Yeah.
And they would notice that one would start to get better than the other. It would grow. They would be able to handle larger magics or cast more magics in a day without becoming exhausted.
Yeah.
But the copy always stayed the same.
Interesting.
And so what this started to create is this kind of separation within elven society, where they started essentially kind of designating the first and the second generation.
The first being the originals.
Right, the pure, the kind of the ones that were the true flesh and blood, and the ones that could technically still grow, learn, and evolve.
Yeah, get better.
And then the second generation being that of these clones that are essentially, at this point, now viewed as a mistake.
But if they all look the same, how do you tell the difference?
And that's kind of the problem they ran into.
Gotcha.
So because of that, and obviously being that these creatures are clones of these very hubristic ant creatures themselves, the clones kind of knew what's up. And so they started very much like kind of blending themselves within society, making sure to stay away from their copies so that there was no clear indication as to who was who.
Oh my, okay.
And so what this ended up doing was the elf kind of higher council had to form kind of this offshoot, this new branch of itself in order to kind of police, monitor, and discover exactly who were the first generation and who were the second generation.
Original from copy. Gotcha. So so that was the formation of the Saracee Council?
Exactly, right. And so that was essentially almost like an Inquisition kind of style of finding different elves and testing them, taking a look, seeing how they performed one day, and then following them for a week and seeing how basically seeing if they have any growth potential.
Gotcha.
But because these are elves and these are beings capable of grand magics, a lot of the second generation kind of understood that and would intentionally hold themselves back, put themselves back at like essentially what looked or perceived as a weaker level.
Okay.
I kind of related to like Dragon Ball Z, right? Where they can like push their energy level down so they can't be read very well.
So it reads as something different.
Right? And so then they knew, okay, if we push ourselves down, we can slowly raise
Show
our
that we're
ability.
growing.
So it looked like they were technically evolving when in reality they're just sandbagging themselves.
Yeah, wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
So this actually caused even with the tests from the council, it still caused issues in that it started to still blend. It was still nigh impossible to truly know unless they died.
Oh.
Because when they died, the clone would fade away.
It would die as well.
Well, no. The clone would cease to exist.
Would just disappear.
Would just kind of fade into the components used to create it. Whereas the first generation would leave a corpse.
Yeah.
There would be a body there.
Yeah.
But obviously, when you have such limited numbers, because at this point, in the early parts, after all of the kind of infighting and conflict, there's some maybe 500 first generation still around.
Whoa, okay.
With probably about 1,500 of second generation.
Oh. Okay.
So it is this kind of hurting to keep the race because you accidentally essentially kind of neutered your own species without realizing it magically.
Yeah, well, they're not procreating it in a way that, keeps the knowledge moving, so to speak. If they're just copies, nobody's growing, really.
Exactly. And so then it really became this like hush where no one, it kind of got hushed through society because it got to a point where if it is discovered one way or another, they kind of don't know how the population spread is anymore. And so if it's revealed that everyone left as a second generation, that could collapse the society, and they weren't ready to experiment with that.
Gotcha.
So they were very much into keeping it secret, keeping it hidden from the rest of society, and that's why they started just kind of adopting the idea that it didn't really matter at a certain point, because essentially through infighting and civil war, they were wiping themselves out.
Yeah, it was just getting worse and worse.
And even at this point, certain other branches of the elven tribes actually started leaving the tree.
Oh, because they disagreed?
Because not wishing to be a part of this politics and not wishing to be put through tests, they decided to just essentially, as Seleucia kind of did, exile themselves.
Yeah.
And choosing to leave rather than play into this politic game.
Well, it looks like Seleucia was more kicked out.
Yeah, it's just more of within elven culture, the idea is they're very much into their power of being a group. And so the idea of being kicked out to the wilderness on your own is essentially
the worst thing they could do to you.
Yeah, they believe, essentially that was, the rest of the mortal world is just going to take you out.
Gotcha. And if I can ask, this group that left, or these groups that left, were they all second generation or were they mixes?
Well, and that's the thing. At that point,
we don't know.
They don't know.
Oh,
and this was just more of a group that was kind of like, it doesn't matter at this point, right? They're us.
We're all people.
We're them. We're all clone. It doesn't really matter because at the same time, it was all based on magic, right? Their magic wouldn't grow. It doesn't mean them as a person couldn't learn new
or
things,
have feelings,
learn new things, have connections. But for the elves, if your magic can't grow, you're useless. You're not what you can become. You're not going to become this apex magical user if you can't grow your magic at all.
Well, that's awful.
Right? And so as that kind of settled down, it kind of, the age-old question kicked back up as they watched once more, as after all this infighting for what the elves was, from their perspective, maybe a decade or two, is hundreds of years to the other races. So as the elves finally clearing out, suddenly saw that most of the other races had expanded across all of the continental realm. And developed and grew, and they saw this go on, and it caused them to come to that discussion once more. So really what ended up happening is, as the society kind of got this idea of, okay, first generation, second generation, and they started just kind of moving on with their lives, well, nature finds a way. And some started discovering the natural way to have a child, finding that there was no difference between first or second generation in having a child.
Oh, so the second generation could have children as well.
They could. Now, obviously, as it became more of a societal thing, the council stepped in again.
Yeah,
right?
Well, that makes things a little more difficult.
Very much wishing for there only to be. And so there became a lot more selective kind of breeding at this point.
Oh, geez.
In that making sure as much as they
only wanted the first generation to
or
breed.
People with the strongest magical talents.
Oh, gosh.
So if they were very, say, gifted in reading the weave, they would want that individual to hopefully have a child with someone just as, if not more, gifted in
Powerful.
reading the weave.
Oh my gosh.
Hoping that, well, fingers crossed that the next progeny will be more powerful.
Yeah.
But there's a chance that they won't be.
That they'll be the complete opposite and powerless.
There are times where certain children disappear because they don't wish these children to allow to be grown.
Oh my gosh.
And this is all handled in secret by the council. So what ends up happening is there's kind of this split where individuals have started to, you know, naturally make connections, and whether they're powerful first, second generation, but have had to hide the documents or the origins of their child, as well as their own status, in order to make sure that it is not only societally approved, but also that this child won't just happen to disappear in the middle of the night.
So they had to make themselves look better than they were in order to even have children.
So status and titles were very important to elves for that exact reason.
Jeez, so even love is really out of the question at this point.
Yeah, but as Seleucia had talked about, in that, you know, that's kind of the first thing they do. They take your titles, they take your because then you're just a regular person.
Just a commoner.
And it doesn't matter what happens to you anymore. And so it really then became even deeper in terms of it. And these kind of regular birthed elves were referred to as the third generation, a combination of both, because essentially what the Elven Council and all the elders had essentially figured that this next generation was the hope for the elves, to erase kind of the marred history of creating clones, and hopefully by not doing anything to this generation as much as they could, hopefully it would see it grow and become better.
Okay. Oof, that's a gamble and a half, I guess.
You know, and for a couple hundred years, that was their goal. But the issue came in the fact of where they decided to call home. So because they are at the Estellestar tree that was essentially birthed through Fey magics, even though they had settled to no longer affect themselves, allow the natural occurrence of nature to happen, they just could not say no. And so what ends up coming
was
down,
too enticing.
They're essentially told now, don't worry about another generation. Make yourself stronger. And that they are perfect. The first generation were the perfect beings to begin with.
Why do you need to change?
Right.
Just
and
get yourself better.
What ends up happening
you don't need
now
children.
Is that a lot of the elders start discovering that there are certain pods developing throughout the Estellestar tree. These like
growing?
Like these kind of large seed pods that are growing on the various branches of the tree.
Okay.
And they notice that if elves were to make contact with them, they are kind of absorbed into the fruit.
What?
And then over time, they emerge. And what they notice is that these elves that emerged were just radiant in Fey energy. Their magic unparalleled to where
Much
they once
stronger.
were.
Oh my gosh.
Allowed, essentially, magic almost happens instantaneous to their thoughts.
Jeez.
But what they also found was that these thoughts were chaotic, that they once scholars and researchers and, teachers,
highly intelligent people,
like essentially always guided by logic, now have lots of fancy flights, mysterious clues and riddles they wish everyone to solve at a moment's notice.
So their sanity meter just drops dramatically.
But their magic is unparalleled, as they essentially at this point have transcended even past that. So what ends up happening is now there is this kind of dichotomy of we can risk it for our future with the new generation.
Yeah.
Or, well, we were always the best.
We can guarantee ourselves.
Exactly.
Oh.
And so another kind of civil war breaks out amongst the elves yet again, as many protest this step towards evolution, seeing it as not something that they should step forward towards, as the more they notice more and more elves developing and changing into these kind of fey-touched elves, the kind of more destabilized the area around them gets. The tree begins warping more kind of exotically, and branches start to kind of spin and swirl very unnaturally to growth of what we would see in trees, as kind of
more fey influence.
As the fey influence begins to kind of essentially get closer and closer to Extrayus. And so what we see is during that time, as they were essentially either forcing or allowing individuals to go through this ascension process.
Wait, they were forcing individuals too?
In some situations, it was kind of as the more logical ones try with others first, as none of the elders
of course
are wishing to do
you
this.
need guinea pigs.
No, the High Council of 12 would never do that, as they don't wish to see themselves lose that logic.
Yeah, of course.
The hope was that if someone was actually strong enough, they would be able to keep their mind. Now, obviously, hopes are always that. They're hopes.
Yeah.
But obviously, it didn't have the greatest of issues. And so what this really started, this chain reaction, as more and more of these elves decided to kind of convert into this ascension, as they called it, the line that connected them to the Fae became thicker and thicker and thicker.
Ooh.
And once about a third of the population had ascended to themselves, they started noticing even more disturbances reaching even farther out through Extrayus proper, and began hearing of different situations. And that time that we are at right there is the time of Salusa. She is currently at the moment where now there is this kind of information that's being spread now of Fae destruction.
They're getting reports,
and of hearing of another unique kind of
power,
magical force they have never experienced before. That seems to be growing as well.
And doing the same as the Fae, just in a different way. Oh my gosh.
And it is in that time that, as we have Salusa's journal, we do know that after a certain point, the elves do fade from history books.
Yeah, they're not seen.
From what in current era, which is where the travelers are, there is no real history of the elves besides the rumors and
their myth at this point.
And the mythos of what they did to try to save the planet.
Yeah, very basic knowledge.
So there's still a lot more to learn about the elves, but really their story is just more of this extreme hubris and this belief that there is no need to become better unless it's just you.
Yeah.
Unless you can become stronger, nothing else matters. Nothing you do matters. And that's the goal. But because of that hubris, they led themselves and unfortunately also potentially the planet to ruin.
And in Salusa's time, that is the beginning of what we now call the Reaping Games.
Exactly, and it's kind of right behind that that event.
Oh, that's got to be horrifying to step into.
And the big thing is that I know we refer to them as elves, but that is merely the name they gave themselves.
Because they read it in the magic.
As they read, they noticed that the strongest practitioners of magic were these creatures that were called elves. And so why not, with that sense of hubris, they refer to themselves as elves?
Yeah, because we gave them a species name. They are known, at least in our world, as the Taur.
So yeah, so that's why it is that kind of funny kind of mechanic in that, yes, they are elves, but really it's just because they are trying to play the role of elves.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, because we're Extrayus is brand new. All the species are different and new. So I was wondering, it's like, why elves?
In a sense, our Extrayan elves are immortal. They do not die of natural causes. It's not
no matter what.
It's not an extended life force. It is literally
forever
an internal life force because they are
of
living magic, which means, but in a sense that there are other ways, obviously, to destroy magic.
Of course.
But
yeah.
that'll be a different deep dive.
Much later.
Now, obviously, I always thank you, especially DnDWife, for sitting to go through into these deep dives because I really want to take a chance to really kind of look into the kind of beginning lore of Extrayus.
Yeah, it's super fun to explore. We're in the world right now in our campaign, but it's really nice to explore the history, what happened before, and why things are happening now.
Yeah, and I think that's why we started with this series on all the species of Extrayus, and now that we've completed that, and hopefully everyone's gotten a little bit of an idea, our next plan, which is our next series of our lore drop, is going to be looking into our magical system.
Yeah.
As we kind of ended with the elves, we talk about them being these creatures of magic, but we haven't really been able to explain or go into the deep
how that's organized,
how it's organized, how it works, and what exactly is the magical forces. What are cosmic magics? What is Seleucia talking about? These we're going to go into more, so please check out more of our deep dives coming up if you want to learn more about the world of Extrayus.
Yeah, I for one am super excited to dive into how the magical array works, just because we created it. So
yeah, I'm definitely down with that.
It's going to be amazing.
So that's going to be a very unique instance, and so I hope that's going to be something, because I know when it comes to magic and building a magical system, you have to impress a lot, because
and it's tough.
You got to be unique, and it's tough. But I think we came up with a pretty cool system.
Yeah, I think so too.
And it's going to take us quite a few episodes in order to get through all of it. So it's going to stand packed for even deeper of a deep dive.
Oh yeah, and if you really liked this episode and any of our other episodes, please feel free to like, review, and join the Couple of Nerds Discord community on our Extrayus Project Discord. We love to hear from anybody who's listening. Let us know what you think about our homebrew ideas, and if you have any ideas yourself, drop them in the comments.
And if you want to listen to any of the lore drop monologues specifically, please check out our YouTube page at Couple of Nerds Podcast.
Absolutely.
We currently have the first 2 up. Check those out, and pretty soon, hopefully, we'll have the complete Seleucia's monologue up.
Yep. And our YouTube videos also have exclusive art from our artist Entlink. So you can see some of the art for our campaign, for the lore drops, for a bunch of the different little things that we do. So thank you so much for joining us today, and have a good night.
Hey, thank you, everyone.
And that concludes today's journey through the realm of Couple of Nerds. We hope you had a blast exploring the intricate world of Extrayus. Don't miss out on the visual extravaganza over at our YouTube page at Couple of Nerds Podcast. It's where the magic comes to life with exclusive video segments, art previews, and a peek behind the curtain.
Dive deeper into our adventures by visiting DnDWifeStories.com, your haven for all our podcast transcripts and a treasure trove of content dedicated to the captivating universe of Extrayus.
Your unwavering support is our greatest treasure. Take a moment to weave your thoughts into a review and hit that subscribe button for an enchanting journey with Couple of Nerds.
Join us beyond the podcast in the Extrayus Project Discord. Connect with us, the creators, and even the travelers themselves. Witness the magic unfold in live drawing streams, game alongside us, and step into our digital tavern, the Bard's Haven. Share your stories and characters with fellow adventurers. Visit DnDWifeStories.com for the link to join our vibrant community.
Stay tuned for more tales, more laughs, and more insight into the world of tabletop gaming. Until then, may your dice be kind, your campaigns epic, and your adventures legendary.